Written late in life, Béla Bartók's Concerto for Orchestra is one of the most frequently performed works of the 20th century. It's remarkable for its brilliant orchestration, teeming invention, and a vast range of compositional techniques, all bearing the unmistakable imprint of the composer's personality.
As a composer, Bartók operated on two different levels. One of them was influenced directly by his love of folk music, which he elevated to an entirely new plane. The other was the level where he composed in his own personal idiom. For him, the grand tradition was the Viennese tradition. Beethoven right at the outset, and then Strauss. But he felt very much on the margin of things. He was very aware of that. This tradition marked him very profoundly, and that was why he turned to a different tradition. He was caught up between the two, and we see him switching back and forth between the two traditions. These two levels in his work as a composer are clearly discernible throughout his life.
Béla Bartók was born on the 25th of March 1881 in the south of what was then Hungary. After studying music in Budapest, he soon developed into the leading figure in avant-garde Hungarian music. At an early stage, he embarked on a systematic study of Hungarian peasant music, which he considered an art form in its own right and which accompanied him throughout his career. In the late 1930s, Béla Bartók was forced to terminate his studies. With the outbreak of the Second World War, the influence of National Socialism became increasingly suffocating and also extended to Hungary.
The terrible things that have been happening all over the world. So much unrest, so much distress. And now this appalling withdrawal by the Western nations. It would be best to get away from here, to escape from this pestilential proximity. But where could one go?
In October 1940, Bartók emigrated to the United States. The first few years were extremely arduous. Together with his wife, Bartók gave concerts as a pianist, but not one single new work materialized. Then in 1943, he received a commission from the conductor Sergei Koussevitzky for the Concerto for Orchestra, which was first performed in Boston on the 1st of December 1944. The first movement of the Concerto for Orchestra begins with an earnest, austere, slow introduction. Gradually, a tonal theme in E minor emerges from this atmosphere, first on the flute and later in the trumpets. In the third movement, this theme plays a central role. For the rest of the first movement, Bartók sticks closely to the classical sonata form. The main theme of the Allegro vivace is typical of Bartók in the way it first surges upwards and then immediately plunges back downwards. Right from the outset, it's clear how the work got its name. In his program note for the first performance, Bartók writes,
"The title of this symphony-like orchestral work is explained by its tendency to treat the single instruments in a concertante or soloistic manner.
The development of the first theme ends with a brief interim motif on the trombone. A change of tempo ushers in the second subject. Initially, the melody in the oboe is based on only 2 notes. They're subjected to rhythmic variation and further development. After the development of these 2 themes, the trombone motif returns to supply the material for a fugato section in the brass. In the closing recapitulation, the 2 themes of this sonata form movement then reappear, this time in reverse order. New York in the 1940s. Bartók arrived in America as a refugee, a fate he shared with thousands of others. A life in exile.
My head is buzzing with all kinds of new words. Names of subway stations and streets, plans of railway networks, and a host of bus routes and interchange stations. Things that are absolutely essential for living here, but otherwise totally fruitless.
Later, Yehudi Menuhin had this to say about Bartók's life in exile.
What he needed and painfully missed in the streets of New York was contact with nature. Sometimes he would stop short in the middle of the petrol fumes, sniff the air and exclaim, "There's a horse here somewhere, I can smell it." His senses were intensely acute. Following his nose, he finally ended up in a small stable where you could hire horses for a ride in Central Park, and there he filled his lungs with the nostalgic fragrance.
Now I have a new plan, to collect the finest Hungarian folk songs and to raise them by adding the best possible piano accompaniment to the level of art song. I have begun my research on Magyar territory, and my criteria for inclusion are purely musical.
Influenced by the composer and musical ethnologist Zoltán Kodály, Bartók embarked on a systematic study of Hungarian folk music in 1905. What he had in mind was a national style that would create something new out of the traditional material still awaiting discovery. As Bartók himself tells us, his approach to the second movement of the concerto for orchestra is less traditional. Many consider it the most original and ingenious section of the whole work. In the printed score, the movement is entitled Giucco delle cppie, or pair games. One after the other, pairs of wind instruments come to the fore, keeping to the same intervals throughout and starting with the bassoons in parallel sixths. The expressive quality of the music hinges essentially on the clever distribution of the rhythmic accents. Here, Bartók imitates old Hungarian dance tunes in the style of the Ferbankos, or recruiting dance.
Bartók was intensely fond of folk music. He found it highly ingenious, though the tradition was oral, not written. I possess a reproduction of the way he noted down folk music. His transcription is incredibly accurate. It must have taken him a very long time to get it so precise.
The reason why the study of all this peasant music was so important for me was that it enabled me to free myself of the omnipotence of the major-minor system. By far the largest and most valuable part of these melodies are in the old church modes, and they also display an astonishing range and freedom in the handling of rhythmic figures and changes of meter.
In the central section of the second movement, the folkloristic atmosphere of the pair games is interrupted by a chorale in the brass.
The more I live with this music, the more I realize that Bartók found solutions all his own. That means, of course, that they were unorthodox, but maybe that is his great asset. He always remained independent. He had his own ideas about music, but he put them into practice both with considerable freedom and with a great deal of discipline.
Bartók calls the third movement Elegia, elegy, and it's here that we find the formal and emotional center of the whole work. It's at the heart of a dual framing structure with two scherzo-like movements coming immediately before and after, themselves flanked by the two outer movements in quick tempo. This arch-like design of the whole work is mirrored by the A-B-C-B-A form of the third movement. In the elegy, Bartók makes use of two motifs from the introduction to the first movement, the bass figure and the trumpet theme. In his introduction to the work, which was written under the shadow of the Second World War, Bartók speaks of the sternness of the first movement and the death song of the third. This can legitimately be seen as a reference to the orgy of destruction unleashed by the Nazis that drove him into exile. Bartók was gravely concerned about the course of events in wartime Europe. At the same time, he was dogged by health problems. Since his arrival in America, he'd been plagued by bouts of fever and severe pain in his joints and nerves. To the very end, his doctors kept him in the dark about the fact that he was suffering from leukemia.
Wenn man denkt an Bartók,
we must always remember what life was like for him in America. He had a very hard time there. His reputation as a composer was non-existent. He was ill and his works were rarely played.
In late 1942, he wrote to his son,
"My career as a composer is more or less over. The quasi-boycott of my works by the leading orchestras continues. No performances of either older works or new ones. It is a shame. Not for me, of course."
Dann also kam dieser Auftrag von Kusewicki.
Then came the commission from Kusewicki.
Die Geste von Kusewicki war wirklich, wie man
This gesture on Kusewicki's part was rather like giving alms to the poor.
Arme Leute, ja. Und dann plötzlich.
But suddenly the piece turned out to be a huge success.
Riesenerfolg mit diesem Stück.
First in Boston,
Das war zuerst in Boston.
and then in New York with the Boston
mit dem
Symphony
Boston
Orchestra.
Symphony Orchestra. Und das war der
It was
erste
Bartók's
Erfolg
first
von
success
Bartók
in America.
So plötzlich,
But he
also
was
hat
too ill
das
for it to
war
register,
eine wunderbare
and he
Zeit.
died
Und
shortly
er
afterwards.
war zu krank, also er ist sofort, fast sofort gestorben.
The fourth movement, Intermezzo Interrotto, interrupted intermezzo, begins with an oboe melody, reminiscent of Romanian folk music. The melody largely consists of just 3 notes from an incomplete diatonic scale. Only the last 2 notes of the melody establish the key, B major. A new melody in violas and violins brings a change of mood. This serenade can be interpreted as expressing Bartók's nostalgia for his homeland. In the central section, the idyllic intermezzo is rudely interrupted by a tawdry-sounding polka. This may be either a quote from Lehar's Merry Widow or a motif already used by Shostakovich in his Leningrad Symphony, probably also for programmatic purposes. At all events, the effect is that of a cruel joke, disrupting the idyllic memories of home.
Hier, das ist wie ein Zitat, also ich meine.
Yes, this is very much like a quotation. It really is very hard to understand what his intentions were. It is humorous, of course, but we don't know what he was making fun of. It's very difficult to fathom. Anyway, we have the serenade, and then this very vulgar interruption, the kind of thing you get in Mahler sometimes. And then he returns to something very, very civilized. So you almost have to exaggerate the contrast, and then we get this.
The fourth movement of the Concerto for Orchestra is frequently referred to as the most programmatic of all, the one where Bartók gives musical expression to the largest number of scenes taken from life. In his program notes, he merely mentions the circular structure of the movement. But he's said to have revealed more of his intentions to the pianist György Sándor, the soloist in the first performance of his third piano concerto. The composer declares his love for his home country, but the serenade is suddenly interrupted by an outburst of brute violence. Coarse men in boots break in on him and even smash his instrument. The finale begins with a strident fanfare from the horns. This whole movement is notable throughout for its whirling dance-like character. The strings play very quick, regular 16th note passages in perpetuum mobile style, a challenge for conductor and orchestra.
I think the last movement of the Concerto for Orchestra was greatly influenced by the virtuosity of the American orchestras. If you look at the violin or the viola part, especially the violin part, right at the beginning of the fifth movement, it makes tremendous demands on the player's dexterity. Also, the atmosphere sometimes changes very drastically and also very unexpectedly. That is what makes it so interesting. Our European orchestras are fully equal to this kind of virtuosity now, but I'm not sure whether they would have been up to it at the time. I think this kind of virtuosity had its origins in America, with Toscanini, Kusevitsky, Stokowski, all those great conductors who aimed at supreme brilliance. But the musical ideas really are typically Hungarian and also typical of Bartók. The virtuosity may be specifically American, but the ideas are genuine Bartók.
Aber die Ideen sind Bartók wirklich.
The first part of the last movement leads into a woodwind fugato in which Bartók returns to the fanfare theme right at the outset. Then the trumpets announce a new pentatonic theme. Shortly afterwards, this theme is used as the subject of a fugue in the strings. After a recapitulation of the dance-like first section, the pentatonic theme in trumpets and strings reappears as a glorious apotheosis in the brass. Never before had Béla Bartók written such triumphant music as in the closing bars of the final movement of the Concerto for Orchestra. In the program notes for the first performance in New York, Bartók outlines the structure and the intentions of his concerto.
The general mood of the work represents, apart from the jesting second movement, a gradual transition from the sternness of the first movement and the lugubrious death song of the third to the life assertion of the last one.